Babalang Babala, Babalang Babala, which is, of course, Tagalog for Achtung, Achtung. And as you all know, we have ways of making you talk, listeners. Tagalog is spoken widely in the Philippines. In fact, about a quarter of the population speak it as their first language. The Philippines saw some bitter fighting after the Japanese invaded in December 1941. US forces lost around 23,000 men killed or captured, not their finest hour, and another 10,000 Filipino soldiers were also lost. I'm sure we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah, we've got to deal with the Philippines,
James?
and MacArthur and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Got to do that. But I quite like that one. I like Babalang Babala.
But it's a bit Sopranos, isn't it? A bit Bada Bing.
It is a bit, yeah. I like it.
Yeah.
Good.
Right, now, we're starting to get the impression some of our listeners are rather big on insubordination. How about this email? So that dates him, from Julian Barrett, who lives and listens in Australia. I'm very much enjoying and learning from your podcast. I know you'll keep up the good work. Your enthusiasm for this... I'm not going to bother with that. Your enthusiasm for the subject is, of course, the huge strength of the whole thing. But, you see, now...
Oh. Lure us in with the praise.
Yeah. But it inhibits your triumphs and objectives in at least two ways. And I am so bold as to suggest the following. Try and speak whole sentences. You both have the tendency to start a sentence 2, 3 or 4 times, and indeed... never finish it, leaving a sort of
never.
Yeah, leaving a sort of impression of meaning short of actual clarity. Let your guests answer your questions. You often butt in with your usually insightful observations, but the poor, knowledgeable and modest bastard is intimidated by your self-confidence, and we don't get to hear enough of his or her expertise. You know what? I think this is about me. And anyway. After giving us a heavy steer that no producer ever would, in their right mind, would ever dream of doing if they wanted to work with me again, after offering us these pearls of wisdom, Julian goes on to offer a rather interesting anecdote. Now, this is good, right? This is worth it. We've had some grit. Now here's the pearl in the oyster. You recently made some comments about Italian POWs in North Africa. I now live in Australia, where many of my friends and fellow citizens have grandfathers who found themselves fighting for the Axis rather than the Allied side in the late unpleasantness, as an old colleague of mine used to refer to World War II. I was talking to Vittorio Bianco from Calabria in Italy, and he said his Italian grandfather was in the Western Desert in 1941. I asked if he survived the war. He did, and so he was presumably a POW. No, said Vittorio. He went back to Italy. What, I asked. Did he say, Sarge, I'm a bit fed up here and I would like to go home? Vittorio said the explanation was that in late 1941 or early 42, his great-grandfather died in Calabria, and that made his grandfather the head of the family, and as such he was repatriated by the Italian army to fulfill his family responsibilities. I suspect that may not have happened in other armies. Keep up the good work, as if you wouldn't. Cheers, Julian Barrett. What do you make of that? That's incredible.
Well, yeah, and actually I've come across a similar one to that because I'm looking at a guy called Giuseppe Bruccoleri, and I talked to his daughter in Gela in Sicily a few months back, and something rather similar. So his father had died, and he had this family business in Gela. He was like the big man in Gela.
Yeah.
And he was an engineer, and he was putting up barrage balloons in Taranto and Naples and so on. And so his mother wrote to Mussolini and said, look, this is intolerable. The man of the family's died. I need my son back here to kind of take hold of the family businesses and stuff. Can I bring him back? And Mussolini wrote back to him and said, yeah, he needs to put up some barrage balloons in Syracuse and in Augusta. And once he's done that, he can go home and do some military stuff there. So he did. And he set up a telephone switchboard and was building, helping to create coastal defences. And because they didn't have enough supplies and enough material, some of them they were making out of cardboard and wood.
Right. And then he changed sides, right?
Yeah, so the night before, the night of the invasion, he told all his men manning the switchboard and himself, he said, right, all our uniforms, let's get rid of them. Let's hide them. We'll get rid of all the weapons, get back into civvy dress. And do you know what? He wasn't arrested.
Well, there you go, you see. Italians, no fools.
Indeed.
Perfect.
So there you go.
Right, now we have a question. And I'm going to declare the interest from my daughter Scarlett, who has been listening, which surprised me, to be honest. She got in touch and said, Dad, I've been listening to the podcast. I really enjoy it. And I'm thinking, right, okay, something's up. How much do you want?
Yes, exactly.
But anyway, Scarlett's been listening, and she says she loves the podcast, right? She wants to know...
And she hasn't got in touch using email.
No, she hasn't used email. It's a Facebook message. Now, and I think this is a really interesting question, actually. She wants to know what happened to German war heroes after the war and how German society, handled them, given they'd A, lost, obviously, and B, been fighting for Nazism, after all, one way or another. And I think that's a really interesting question because, obviously, in this country, are war heroes... forgotten or not, at least were celebrated. You could wear your medals. You did have a cenotaph parade. You did have Commonwealth War Grave Commission graves for the fallen and so on. What happens in Germany? Because you must have interviewed people.
Yeah,
you interviewed aces along the way for the Battle of Britain book. So
yeah, I have, and I'll come to one in a minute. But I would say one of the top 5 most profoundly moving interviews I've ever done with veterans was with a German called Friedrich Buchner. Yeah. And he lived in a little place called Ludwigstadt, which was kind of southeast of Leipzig. So had ended up being, I think, in the kind of, on the East Germany in the Second World War. And his family business was making little slate boards. They had a slate mine in the town. And they had the kind of biggest house in the town, which wasn't very big, but it was sort of bigger than most. And they used to make these little chalkboards for people in schools, so that you would, you'd write with, you'd have a little one each, a bit the size of an iPad or something, and that's what they used to make. Anyway, I went down to visit him. He'd been serving in Italy, and we got talking and talked about the 1930s and stuff, and it was all going absolutely fine. And then we had. His wife made us a lunch, and it was sort of classic German stuff, lots of boiled potatoes and cabbage and all that kind of crap. And it was all very fine. And then he said afterwards, look, we'll continue the conversation upstairs. I've got a room at the top of the house, and we'll go out there, and my wife will bring up some coffee. So we went all the way up the stairs, and it was this kind of attic room in the top, and in there was just books and books and books on World War II, and there was his Iron Cross second class on the framed on the wall and all the rest of it. Yeah. And anyway, we started getting to the nitty gritty of his wartime experiences as an artillery officer, junior artillery officer, arriving in the front, kind of I think very early part of 1945. And his wife came up with some coffee, and it was little cups and saucers, and as he was pouring it out, he was starting to shake. And I remember thinking, oh, I hadn't noticed that before. And we got to the retreat across the River Po, and he was explaining how they had to shoot all their horses, and people were drowning in the river and desperate to flee across the River Po. This was sort of, April 1945. And suddenly he just lost it. He absolutely lost it. He was, I'm not talking about welling up a bit. He was in full on head in hands, buckets of water. Right. And of course, I said to him, "Look, please, I really don't want you to be upset about this. Don't feel you've got to tell me." And between his sobs, he kept going, "No, I want to. Anyway, he recovered his composure, and telling the rest of the story, and they managed to get across the Po, and he was retreating up. They're just tramping up, and eventually they got into the kind of foothills of the Alps. They were trying to get back through the Tyrol into Austria. They got captured by partisans, and amongst the partisans, the prisoners that the partisans had were a bunch of Russians who'd been fighting on the side of the Germans. And the Russians decided, the partisans decided to execute the Russians. But they were all kind of, ill-trained partisans and stuff. They weren't, and they made a really ham-fisted job of it. And several of these guys weren't dead. They were lying on the ground screaming. And again, he just absolutely lost it. Friedrich Buchner just lost it. He was just in bits. He could, we were just sat there. Christ, my bottom lip was going. I mean, it was really, really deeply upsetting. And he recovered again, and he said, that was the 30th of April 1945. It was the day Hitler shot himself, and it was my 19th birthday.
God almighty.
And it was just absolutely amazing. And anyway, he recovered, and we talked about his post-war life and stuff. And actually, he'd sort of, had an okay time. Yeah. But at the end of the interview, he said, I said, well, look, I'm really sorry for making you go through that. But I said, that was the most incredible conversation. I'm really, really glad you shared that with me. And he said, I have never, ever told anyone what I've just told you.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And I thought, but God, how amazing! You know, our guys. It doesn't matter how traumatic it was, how upsetting it was, how broken they are by their experience in the Second World War. At least they're patted on the backs. At least we wear poppies on, in November.
Yeah.
At least we have Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday and all the rest of it. We venerate these guys. They're complete heroes. We really put them on a pedestal. He has done exactly what they've done. He's been an 18-year-old recruited, totally beyond his control, gone out to the Second World War, found himself in this absolute maelstrom, total nightmare of violence and just totally removed from anything he could ever possibly have understood as a boy growing up in this backwater of South or East Germany. Been through all that, done his bit, gone back, and he's got to feel ashamed of what he went through. He's got to bury it.
But we've talked about this quite a lot. That at the end of the war, when, for instance, Bergen-Belsen is discovered, the whole British Army goes, "Oh right, that's what we're fighting about. That's what we're actually here to stop." And they, and up to that point, you've had people fighting for each other, fighting so they can get home, fighting because they've been conscripted, all the myriad of different reasons. The kind of the crusade moment has passed, hasn't it? By the start of 1945, and then they discover the death camps, and that has a massive impact, moral, sort of injects a moral core to the Allied effort,
of course,
that people were perhaps unaware of. Certainly, that and David Baddiel's program really recently about Holocaust denial. There's that bit where he goes to the National Archive and he finds the thing saying, don't let's not dwell on the fact that Jews are suffering really horribly under the Nazi regime because people are anti-Semitic. They might not buy that. But then at the end of the war, you get this thing. What impact does the discovery of those camps, or not? Discovery is perhaps the wrong word for Germany at the end of the war. The public display of those camps and the actual, because after all, there's the endless debate. But people knew that Jews were being moved east, euphemistically or whatever, or sent elsewhere or whatever. But the public display of it, and after the war, films were made and Germans were made to go watch films of the death camps and the concentration camps, and they were, certainly Bergen-Belsen, the locals were sent to look at the camp. What does that do to the soldier who up to that point has thought as best he can within the Nazi regime? Because after all, the other thing that changes after 1943 is Goebbels is quite explicit and says, well, given the stuff we've done, we're all in this together now, and we've got to fight. We've got to fight to the death. But what must that have done to your 19-year-old? It goes, oh shit! The thing I was fighting for was this. The thing I was fighting to defend. Because after all, with fighter pilots in particular, for instance, fighter pilots, it often gets framed in chivalric terms, and it gets framed in terms of, Knights of the Air, and it's in a way it's Peep Show. Are we the bad guys? It's that moment. And what must that have done for guys who thought they were just I'm just a soldier. Hans von Luck was just a soldier, but he met Hitler for crying out loud. You know what I mean? And that's the thing I think's really, 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 really interesting, because obviously a lot of that went underground, and German veterans must have met and talked about the good old days, but had to elide around the moral
there
question.
are lots and lots of veterans societies. I mean, there's a whole U-boat thing going on. There's huge U-boat veteran societies, and they meet regularly. Ditto with Knight's Cross winners. Ditto with the SS, of course. With lots of SS fraternities and stuff. But if you're a 19-year-old like Friedrich Buchner, you are a total pawn. I mean, you're just a total innocent caught up in this. You're going to war for all the same reasons that a British soldier is, or an American is, because you've got to, because you're fighting for your country, for your neighbours, for your family, because you don't have any choice.
Yes, of course, but yes, of course.
So he comes back and he probably just thinks, right, I've just got to bury it. I've just got to not think about it. But of course, inevitably, as you get older, and to a certain extent, you're concentrating so hard on kind of trying to rebuild Germany, rebuild your life, just create some normality again, that actually that's sort of quite possible in many circumstances. And it's only when you sort of get to your 60s and you start retiring and, suddenly you've got a bit of time to contextualise what happened to you, that you start thinking about it all and, and start analysing it a little bit. And that's entirely common, whatever nation you're from. I mean, it's interesting, Hans-Eckard Bob, who's a fighter pilot that you've just been reading about. And I met a number of times and I really liked him. I mean, he was really good fun. But I mean, he as well as interviewing him, he also did write a memoir. It was called Betrayed Ideals. I mean, that's his memoir. And his memoir isn't just about his time in the war. It's also about his post-war life as well. And a lot of these guys, they've had incredible responsibility. They've been the top guy, and suddenly they're not. Suddenly they're just Mr. Shabby with no, with two pfennigs to their name, and they've got to kind of make a go of it. I mean, what you find is quite often is a lot of these guys who are better educated, who have had authority, that actually they're the ones, of course, who get on in life because they've got that natural leadership, they've got that intuition, that intelligence, and all the rest of it, that kind of spirit, that fight that enables them to kind of rebuild their lives. And Hans-Eckard Bob ends up being a kind of farm labourer originally, and then sets up a haulage business, and it's pretty successful. And he was great. I mean, he was still flying the rest of his life. I mean, he flew right up into his 90s. Had JG54 incorporated into his car number plate.
Yeah. But also, what happens after the war, 3 years later, is basically from the idea of intense denazification, the idea of we need to completely bring everyone to justice. Is the Cold War starts, and so an awful lot of people who've been let's be honest now. If you're high up in the Wehrmacht, if you're high up in the Heer, you knew exactly what was going on. You knew exactly what you were fighting for. You're not a 19-year-old pawn. And those people then, of course, get gobbled up by the Bundeswehr because the Red Army's a threat and all this sort of thing. And the town planners who worked for Speer, for instance, in Berlin, then after the war, are the town planners in Berlin, and the same in Hamburg and all over Germany, like a whole.
Absolutely. And it's the same in France to a certain extent. I mean, de Gaulle quite consciously says, okay, we're not going to go after all these milices. We're not going to go on about, we're not going to talk about our anti-Semitism in the Second World War, because if we do that, we'll never recover as a nation. Which is why when The Sorrow and the Pity comes out in 1968, which is this absolutely pioneering landmark documentary series about France's experience in the Second World War through the prism of one town, which is Clermont-Ferrand in the Auvergne, it's banned. And it isn't shown, I think, until late 1980s or early 1990s and stuff. I mean, if you haven't seen it, I really couldn't recommend it more. It's totally brilliant. But I mean, there is this kind of real politic gets in the way where you just have to sort of get on and rebuild. And what's really interesting, I mean, we've mentioned Guy Walters in his book Hunting Evil in the past. I mean, he always says, much better title for it should have been Not Hunting Evil, because a handful of people are executed, there's the Nuremberg trials, and then everyone kind of runs out of steam, because there's other things to worry about and other things to kind of, and real evil guys who've done terrible things end up working for MI6 and the CIA and the KGB and stuff. I mean,
and sending people to the moon.
And people end up, exactly, of course, and end up in Argentina. And people, there is just no will to go and do this. And Simon Wiesenthal claiming that, he's tracked down thousands. He hasn't. He's tracked down about 6. I mean, literally.
Well, there's a moment where we're going to need to take a break. We've made it to our metaphorical breach, but before we scramble up under the fire of the guns, we'll take a short break. Just time to thank our one listener in the Åland Islands for his or her support. You've got the time it takes for this break to tell us where the Åland Islands are, of course. See you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Now, at the risk of turning this into a bizarre geographical quiz show, who got the Åland Islands out there? Which one of you? I don't believe you. No, they're not there. Quite wrong. They're nowhere. No, they're not near the Philippines, and they're not No, they're not an archipelago off Argentina that's disputed. They're actually a collection of around 6,500 islands in the Baltic Sea. The islands are Finnish. The population speaks Swedish, of course. They're autonomous. And how about this? In World War II, their merchant fleet sailed both for the Allies and for Germany. Amazing. Extra marks if you got that last bit. Right. Now, you mentioned Hans Eckhard Bob as earlier on. Now, I have been reading... For money, let's be honest now. I've been reading the audiobook of your Battle of Britain book.
Well, I'm glad you got paid, because if you hadn't, I'd just felt too much in your debt, and it would just be.
Well, I read it. Well, yeah.
I'll be beholden to you, and that just wouldn't be right.
Given it's over 800 pages, and my word, it's a thick book.
Okay, but it's 800 pages because it's got a lot of sources and index and all that kind of crap.
That's what I wanted to.
It's divided. Okay, it is divided into 4 parts.
Yep.
Each chapter is no more than 15 pages long, so you can take your time over it. You can you're still making progress.
Yeah. Well, anyway, for several things. I want to say how much I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you.
What I really liked about it is because the Battle of Britain. It isn't a historical event. It's a movie. It's books by Len Dayton. It's Airfix Spitfires.
It's almost a way of life.
It's almost a way of life. And what was really fantastic about your book, I thought, and I'm not just saying this, because when's it out?
Oh, I can't remember, but I think it might be the 19th of March.
Right, okay. That's the day before my tour resumes.
Wow.
The 20th of March in Watford. Global pandemics permitting.
Yes.
What I really liked about it is it's not just about the air battle, and you don't start in June 1940 or May 1940. You lay the whole thing out, and particularly the thing I really, really, really loved was once you've got it all up and running, you go, right, well, actually, here rather than doing in 1938 work starts to the fighter defence system. Once the battle's up and running, you go, right, here's the Dowding system, here's how it was set up, here's who he hired, here's who he was dealing with, here's who he spoke to, and how well joined up everything was. Even with the Air Ministry sort of being bureaucratic and slow, that the different bits, the different cogs that Dowding has at his disposal and the things he creates as well, it's really, really interesting. Because if you come at it from the air battle as it starts when the RAF is under strength, if you come at it from that point of view, you don't know that the sort of, because the fighter pilots are literally the tip of the iceberg. Yeah. They are literally, in the case of the defence system for the Battle of Britain, they very much are, the sat atop, they're the guys on top of the rocket rather than the people who built the rocket. And
yes.
And I think the way you make that point is really it really comes over very well. It's really important as well, because otherwise you can easily slither down into the few myth, which is it's 600 blokes save the world, whereas in fact it's 600 blokes with hundreds of thousands of people working.
It's the many, not the few.
Aim.
That's the point. It's the many, not
exactly.
the few. And well, I'm glad it hit all those, ticked all those boxes for you. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to do. And like everybody else, I started off with the Battle of Britain movie. In fact, actually, I didn't. I started off with seeing that Spitfire when I was playing cricket, going up to Duxford, walking around the bookshops, picking up David Crook and Spitfire Pilot, and just thinking, where's 1940 been all my life? I mean, what? I mean, for me, 1940 is just tops, but I just find it so endlessly fascinating. Well, and when it came to when I suddenly, and I've written a novel I've written 2 novels actually with a backdrop of the Battle of Britain. So suddenly I had this golden opportunity to write this history book of the Battle of Britain, and I thought, this is, for me, this is the daddy. I mean, I'm never going to have this opportunity again. Got to get it as right as I possibly can with the kind of what I know with what I've got at my fingertips at that particular time. I did a shitload of research for it, and I just found unlaying, peeling off these layers of the onion, so fascinating. And I really wanted to tell it in the round. I wanted to tell that story of Bomber Command, of
Yes.
Coastal Command, of Harry Tate's Navy. I mean, that's just amazing. All these completely rugged fishermen who've been plying their trade all their lives down the East Coast, and there's nothing they don't know about the sea and the North Sea. And there they are on their trawlers with their kind of 20mm cannon kind of stamped onto the poop deck, laying mines and sweeping for mines instead of for mackerel. I mean, it's just totally brilliant. And the ability of Britain to kind of just harness all these people in very quick order and put them into an effective defence force is just amazing.
Right, but there's one thing
you got upset about.
No, not upset about, that I really need to ask some questions about.
Got him.
Right. Now, one of the things you do really well in the book is you compare Beaverbrook and Udette, right? And you look at Udette and you look at Beaverbrook and you say, here's basically, crony appointments. Make no bones about it at all. Beaverbrook is a crony appointment. He's a crony pal of Churchill's, but it works out fine, right?
Yeah.
And Udette is a crony mate of Goring's, and it's a disastrous appointment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of spectacularly so. And doesn't he end up killing himself?
Yes, he does. Yeah, in November 94.
Yeah, right. Because he just can't deal with it, right? Cannot deal with it. He's a drunk. He can't cope with the responsibility.
He's drug addict.
Drug addict, drunk. And he knows perfectly well also that the kit he's producing is all rubbish because he's out of his depth and all that. Now, the only reason this came to mind is having read Adam Two's Wages of Destruction, right?
Yeah.
He makes the point that Spear becomes head of organisation Todd and takes over the fighter production drive, and that's a crony appointment, right? Pala Hitler's, right? And immediately says, look at the fighter production uptick I have created. But the point Twos makes is he says airframes take 6 months to lay down, 9 months to lay down. So an uptick that coincides with an appointment is no such thing. It's correlation isn't causation.
I'm seeing where you're going with this.
Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
So Beaverbrook gets the job, crony appointment. You get an uptick in fighter production. But those airframes were laid down months before.
Yes, and this is where my generosity to Beaverbrook has been challenged by Seb Cox, who is a lovely chap and the head of the Air Historical Branch, and he thinks I've been too generous in this. What I say is that is not the case. Airframes are not laid down. They don't take 6 months to make. What you do, but the machine tools do.
Jigs and tools and stuff.
Jigs and machine tools absolutely do, and so do shadow factories. The point is that the shadow factories are already there and in existence, but they're not working very efficiently. And what Beaverbrook does is, in very, very quick order, turns them from having all the facilities which are already in place and which have been set up by people like Wilfred Freeman and Lord Swinton, who are absolute key players in all this. And they've been doing that in the background in 1938 and 1939. What Beaverbrook does is cut out loads and loads of red tape and just sharpen up the whole thing. And that sharpening up the whole thing means that they're operating at 365, 24/7, rather than kind of 9 to 5, kind of Monday to Friday. And that's the big difference. And that results in exponential growth. And the other problem is, the other thing that Beaverbrook correctly gets is there are all sorts of bottlenecks in this whole process. And the whole sorting out a bottleneck in the traditional kind of pre-war way is what you do is you write to someone, it sits on their desk for 2 days, then they write back, it sits on your desk for 2 days, and then eventually kind of 10 days later something happens. He just thinks, sod that, I'm not doing any of that, I'm just going to pick up the blower. And if the phone call and the bollocking doesn't work, then he sends someone straight down to Castle Bromwich or wherever it might be, or Supermarine in Southampton Water, and kicks butt. And that's what he does. And he has all those sort of messages up in his office saying things like, committees take the punch out of war and stuff, which I love.
Well, which is really interesting, because one of the things Spear does is sets up a load of committees. So, the Allied war effort is often characterised as a collegiate committee war effort, and that's why it works.
Yeah. After
all, Churchill runs a collegiate war cabinet.
Yes.
Where people can argue with him and say no to him. And Brooke, of course, famously is the guy who says no to Churchill all the time, and curbs his sort of more crazy ideas and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And yet Speer famously sets up a bunch of committees that have got sort of dynamic names, and then takes credit for anything.
Yeah, he does. And actually, I mean, the person who's responsible for the massive improvement in production of the Luftwaffe, of course, is Erhard Milch, who's a field marshal, and he is, without a shadow of doubt, one of the most competent people and administrators in Nazi Germany, and he's certainly the most competent person in the Luftwaffe by a country mile.
By miles.
And he is the guy who set all this stuff up. And the point is that the moment he's already started to take over from Udet in the summer of 1941, because Udet's just totally out of it. And then once Udet commits suicide, then Milch does take over completely. So by the time that the Central Planning comes into being, which is in maybe, let's say for argument's sake, April, May 1942, under Speer, when Speer takes over from Todt in February 1942, there is there are three people in charge of the central planning. There's Milch, there's Speer, and there's this third guy who has no role whatsoever. He's just a kind of nominal person. It is basically the Milch and Speer show. It's just that Speer is the kind of PR darling and the public figure and the one who's close to Hitler, and Milch isn't. But Milch is doing every bit the work that Speer is doing, and more. And he is the one who is working to build up the Luftwaffe, but he's already got that in process by the time the central planning and he pals up with Speer in the first place. Just go back to Beaverbrook though. What is really interesting about Beaverbrook is Beaverbrook also completely transformed the Civilian Repair Organisation, the CRO, which is absolutely key to the whole thing. And it's not just about producing new Spitfires, it is and Hurricanes. It is also about fixing them and getting them back on, because 30% approximately of all the casualties in the Battle of Britain are homebound accidents, without any enemy whatsoever. And you've got to kind of repair that. And he changes that around. He takes out the Air Ministry out of the whole thing. He takes out the Ministry of Production out of the whole thing, and just basically runs the whole show himself and streamlines it and puts it into these different categories and all the rest of it. And it is that overhaul of the Civilian Repair Organisation combined with his complete kind of I'm a total shit, everyone's got to work like slaves approach, and the kind of reduction of aircraft types to just 3 bombers and 2 fighters, single engine fighters, which kind of again streamlines the whole thing. That is what makes a difference on a foundation which has already been set up but isn't working very efficiently. So I think he is absolutely due his credit.
Okay, good. Well, okay. I'm still sucking my teeth at that. Now, okay. So Ryan Liddell has written to us. We've got some questions from the listeners rather than just from me trying to wind you up. Ryan Liddell says, "Love the show. You guys are amazing." Well,
thanks, Brian.
Our listeners are great. They're the best. Why was the 8th Army named so? As there weren't many British armies in the field.
Yes, well, that's an extremely good question, and one that I don't have a precise answer to, except that it's to do with making it seem like there's more than there are. Yeah. But why they chose the 8th, I'm not sure. I think it's I tell you exactly why it is. It's because there are 7 French armies.
Ah.
Yeah. And France was an ally at the time, and so they had that, and they didn't want to have any confusion, so they went to 8.
But then Torch is First Army.
Yeah, but the French are gone by then. We don't care.
I know.
Although I know the 8th Army comes afterwards. Yeah, well, and also the reason the First Army is called the First Army is because it is a combined Anglo-US army. Although it is commanded by the British and run on British lines, there is US 2 Corps is attached to First Army. So it is a kind of it's given that first moniker because it is something really new and exciting.
It's brand new, yeah.
And 18th Army Group is called 18th Army Group because of 1 for First Army and 8 because of 8th Army.
Yeah, and then you get Second Army for Normandy. So they start to go numerical at that point. And then 14th Army, which was Army East Command, wasn't it?
Yes.
So they get given a number. Slim picks a number.
Yeah. Eastern Army, and I don't know why. Well, I think there's always been a 10th Army, isn't there, in Iraq, and there's been a 12th Army which is used in 1943, and 13 is unlucky, so no one would ever call them. No one would ever have a 13th Army.
But a lot of this
in fact, I don't think there's ever been a 13th Army.
Maybe there has. Maybe there was a German 13th Army. Who knows? Anyway, the thing is...
That got completely destroyed in a pocket in the Soviet Union.
Because the thing with the airborne divisions, for instance, there's 1st Airborne Division, 6th Airborne Division. That is purely to give the impression there are 6 airborne divisions.
Yes.
And then you get... and they merge after the war and become 16th Airborne Brigade, I think,
yes.
Eventually, when they get merged and shrunk. So... I mean, that is an interesting thing. The numbering is sort of intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's first, there's the FUSAG, isn't there? The Phantom Army that Patton commands before D-Day.
Yes, the first US Army group, first US Army group. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Well, 101st Airborne Division. There aren't 100 American airborne divisions, but that's the 101st Airborne is a converted existing formation. They use the existing headquarters as something else. Same way with 82nd. Yes, I mean that is a really good question actually. Surely what they would have at the War Office is, because the same with operation names, is they'd have they'd have a folder, wouldn't they? And they go, right, the next army we're going to number is going to be 2nd Army. We've done the badges already in the paperwork.
Yeah, you'd have thought so, wouldn't you? Yeah. With squadrons, it's interesting because first 1 to 200 are RAF British squadrons, 300s are foreign, so Czech, Belgian, Polish.
303, yeah.
400s, I think, are New Zealand, aren't they? And Canadian, maybe.
And the 600s, are they reserve?
They're auxiliary ones, and then they run out. They've run out by the time they get to 617 and 618 squadrons.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was a style thing with your Battle of Britain book is say first squadron or number 1 squadron or 23rd squadron. You wouldn't call it 2-3 squadron, would you? But you'd call 606 606. You wouldn't go the 609th squadron.
No, it's very interesting. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I always try and do with the books, because you're conscious that you're trying to keep people interested, and you want those units to be familiar, and you want them to sink in. So I always try and write the military units in the language of the nation of which I'm talking about, because that immediately makes, so instead of saying, 3rd Squadron of JG-27, I would go 3 Staffel, because then you immediately know it's Luftwaffe, not RAF that I'm talking about.
Yeah, Staffel of Geschwader, Jagdgeschwader 2 and all that.
But I'm getting in a massive pickle at the moment in Sicily with 429 Little Circle, Battaglioni Costiera for the Italians. It's all got quite complicated, and I'm slightly wondering whether I need to kind of break my rule.
Oh well, there's a.
I mean, you're going to know it's Italian, aren't you? If you see that,
well, you are going to know it's Italian. It saves you that problem,
I suppose.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that was all good. Well, you know what I'm going to say now, don't you, ladies and gentlemen? Hanggang Samuli, which is, of course, see you soon in Tagalog.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.